With each passing day, the global economic news seems to be gloomier. Just last week, IMF released its latest forecast that the world's economic growth will slow down to 2.2%, as compared to 5.2% last year. The advanced economies is going to shrink by 0.3%. And this is the first contraction since the Second World War. The developing economies will grow by 5%. So essentially, 100% of the world's economic growth will come from the growth in the developing economies, and foremost from China and India. China is predicted to grow 9.7% this year, 8.5% next year, and India is to grow 7.8% this year and 6.3% next year. Latest forecast. Now, no doubt, the developing economies are also dragged down by the financial meltdown. Nonetheless, they remain the bright spots, the only bright spots in the global economy. The global economy has been undergoing transformational change over the last 20 years. It's shifting from a US-dominated global economy to a multipolar world. And the current economic turmoil only accelerates this transformation. If the Great Depression marked the transfer of the baton from UK to the US, I venture to say that the current economic turmoil could potentially mark the beginning of the transfer of the economic baton from the US to China. So let's look at some data. In recent years, 50% of the world's economic growth derived from the growth in the developing economies. And over the next 2 to 3 years, 100% of that growth will come from the developing economies. You look at the share of the export. Developing economies' share of the world's export was only 23% in 1970, but 43% by 2005, and headed higher. And you look at the foreign exchange reserve. Developing economies accounted for 70% of the world's foreign exchange reserve. China alone has accumulated 1.9 trillion foreign exchange reserve through September this year, and most of that foreign exchange reserve is parked in US Treasury bills. So in essence, it's the developing economies that are financing the developed economies. That is a picture that is very different from even 20 years ago. You look at the flow of deals. In 2007, for the first time, that the developing to developed economies deals is bigger than from the developed to developing economies. Here, we're talking about stories such as India's Tata buying the Anglo-Dutch steel giant Chorus. We're talking about China's Lenovo buying IBM's PC business, or this year Tata buying Ford's Jaguar and Land Rover business. Now, when the Japanese and the Korean firms, like the Sony and the Toyota and the Hyundai and the Samsung, when they went global in the 1970s and 1980s, they did so mostly through organic growth. But the emerging giants, they are globalizing through acquisitions and mergers, and hence at a much faster rate. Okay? And also, you look at the flow of outbound FDI. Look at how fast it has been growing, doubling for China from 2006 to 2007, tripling for India from 2006 to 2007. So it's not so clear now in these days who is the hunters, who is the hunted. Now, with the current economic turmoil, with the European and US assets in depress, might we see more predators coming from the East possible.